Let's go.
Once upon a time, we share the stories of old. Bring the book to life in a way never told. Let's go for a ride, never let go. Fresh fairy tales, that's time for the show. Fresh fairy tales.
Let's go.
Happy birthday, Golothy. Don't open until tomorrow. Love, Nana.
Hey, it's my birthday. I'm gonna party like it's my birthday.
Golothy, it's coming! I wanna miss it! It's coming! Hi!
Say, Mom, can you knock?
Knock? I'll give you a knock.
Gosh, Mom, I'm 16 tomorrow. I'm going to need a little privacy around here.
Might be. As long as you live under my roof, there'll be no such thing as privacy. What's that? Circle Gabriella! It's catastrophe 10,000! Yeah! I wanna miss it! I wanna miss
Where am I? Wow, this place is beautiful.
Help! Help me! Someone help me, please! Stop that right now before I tell your dad!
Hey, get away! Go on, get out of here!
Thank you so much. I know I'm a scarecrow and I'm supposed to scare these people away, but I'm not very good at it.
Hi, my name's Golothy. What's your name?
I am Scarecrow!
Oh, are you okay? Come on, stand up.
Stand up?
Yeah, just need to use your brain to tell your legs to stand up.
Oh, right. Well, that's not going to happen because that's what I need.
Legs?
No, a brain.
What? You don't have a brain?
I had a darn good brain before. I used to be a qualified doctor.
What happened?
Okay, one night I was working late doing surgery on a patient's dried crack feet. And boy, were they dried in the Sahara Desert. The only remedy was coconut oil for those feet. When suddenly, she woke up. And she snatched my brain out of my head and ran off with it into the night. Oh, well, she left this on the way out.
Eseka Fayumu Ma'imau Kangaka, a.k.a. the Wicked Witch of the East.
I miss my brain, but I don't know how to get it back.
Hey, maybe I can help you find it. My mom said if ever I need help to go and see the Wizard of Otara. I don't know what this wizard can do for you, but maybe he'll have a spare brain for you.
Really? The Wizard of Otara? Okay. What do I have to lose?
Great. Let's go.
Okay.
Wizard of Otara, look out, we're coming for ya. Wizard of Otara, we'll follow this brick road to ya. Wizard of Otara, we're coming for ya.
Somebody help me!
What's that noise?
Anybody there? I think he's coming from the tin can.
Tin can.
Hello? Are you okay?
Oh, can you help me? Can you just grab my battery pack? Right there, on that thing, that one. If you can just plug it in. Come on. Plug it in.
Is that better?
Oh, woo! Feel like I'm 21 again. You sure took your time.
A thank you would be nice.
Oh, thank you for taking your time.
Oh, cool. I guess you won't be needing this then.
What? Oh, yeah, I need that.
What you need is a heart.
Well, look over here. I don't have a heart.
Oh my God, he's heartless.
What happened to your heart?
Oh, none of your business.
Oh, fine then. Let's go.
Okay, I'll tell you. Can you just plug me in? This is awkward. Fine then.
I was a lovable guy, I was a little bit shy. My favorite thing to do was to make her smile. It all changed when I met this girl. Prettiest picture with the prettiest curls. She followed me on Insta, sent her a smile. She sent me one back, didn't match her profile. Red flags. She wanted to meet up and I was like, wow. This could be it, let's get lit right now. I was waiting on her to show up at 6, then I realized it was all a trick. She played me like a fool, she stole my heart, left me to rust like a pick-a-pop. How could you be so heartless? How could you be so heartless? How could you be so heartless? Where is my heart?
That's horrible. No wonder you're so mean and heartless.
Hey, you should come with us to go see the wizard.
Before.
Well, he's going to give me what was that thing?
A brain? And maybe he can give you a heart too.
Really?
Really.
Okay, fine. Lead the way.
You are my one and only tropical island girl. I love you, like I love you. 685 to the world. You are the apple of my lazy eye. I hope one day I can call you mine.
Here, let's go. If love was a person, it would be someone like you. Big bushy hair, big curvy hips, and a big size 14 shoe. True, it's the way you've been making me feel cool. This feeling is so surreal, cause girl, you make me sing out loud. Baby, I love it to you.
Cause baby, I love it to you. Cause baby, I love it to you. Cause baby, I love it to you. Cause baby, I love it to you.
Wow, you have a beautiful voice.
Why are you screaming? He's a lion and lion eat people.
Oh, right.
No, I don't eat people. I'm vegan and I'm lactose intolerant, okay?
Yeah, well, you shouldn't roar at people. It's rude.
Sorry, I just saw your faces and it gave me a fright.
Yeah, you want to talk?
Tin Man, don't be so mean. You have a beautiful voice. Can you sing us another song?
I can't sing in front of anyone.
Why?
It's too painful.
Oh, can't be that bad.
Well, it is that bad, okay?
Come on, you can trust us. Everyone has their own story.
Yeah, see, look. I got a new hat.
Oh, and what about you?
I'm fine, thanks.
He's got no brain.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Heart, brain, oh, you lost your beauty, right?
Right. Anyways, just tell us your story.
I can't.
Let's go.
Long ago, I was the king of the jungle. I had the best voice in all of Bango Bango. You know Beyonce? I sang with Beyonce before Destiny's Child. Fifth harmony, I was the 6th, 7th, and 8th harmony. You know Sole Mio? I was Mio! Do you know who my soul is? I had it all. I had the fame, the fortune, the money, the fame. Until one night, I received an anonymous comment on one of my videos, 1 million views. You're gonna hear me. So I went back to the concert that night. I stood right behind the mic, and just as I was about to sing, and I froze. I lost my courage that night. And I guess I haven't been able to sing in public ever since.
Did you find out who made that comment?
No, but I rang the FBI, the CIA, the IRD, and the SPW. And nothing. So I went onto Facebook and I did my investigating skills and I GPS'd it all the way back to the Wicked Witch of the East.
Oh, that son of a...
Which
Witch.
of the East? Well, maybe you can come with us. We're off to see the Wizard of Otara. Maybe he can help you find your courage so you can perform again.
You really think so? Okay, yeah, let's go see this wizard guy.
That way.
Wizard of Otara, Wizard of Otara. Look out, we're coming for ya.
made it. Wow, this place is so pretty.
Come on, guys. Let's look for this wizard. Wizard, is that you?
Welcome to Wins.
Wins?
Wizards in New Zealand?
Oh, got it. Hey, can you help us, please?
Is it an emergency?
Yeah, I lost my hat.
I lost my courage and I lost my
Your brain.
my brain.
Oh my God.
So then what did you lose?
I lost my home.
Cyclone Gabriella? Home is where the heart is.
Home is where my mom is, and I miss her. Wizard of Otara, could you help us, please?
I guess I can.
Yes, I told you that.
But on one condition.
What's your condition?
Defeat the Wicked Witch of the East.
Yes!
Why us? You're the wizard here, mate.
Well, she's gone on a bend of terror. We need someone smart, loving, brave to defeat her in her wicked ways.
Brain!
Roll out the red carpet, cause baby girl, the Wicked Witch of the East has arrived.
Wow, I've never expected her to be so beautiful.
Oh, thanks, sugar. Wish I could say the same.
Ow! I believe you're taking something from my friends.
My. Why so serious? You want it? You're gonna have to take it from me by beating me in a dance battle.
Dance battle!
So la, Eva mai, pull up to me bumper, solid, uso, toko, what? Lalo mai, siva mai, Eva mai, coli mai, hey. Lalo mai, siva mai, Eva mai, coli mai, hey. Lalo mai, siva mai, coli mai, hey.
Family makes the dream work.
Hey, look, I got my hat back.
I got my courage.
Yeah. Well, according to my calculations, you have your heart back, you have your courage back, which means we defeated the witch and lifted the curse.
Wait, you need to slow down with your big words, Mr. Smarty Pants.
Whoa, looks like someone got his brain back.
Ah, I see.
Well, thank you so much, sis.
We couldn't have done it without you.
What's the matter? You okay?
I miss my mom. And I just want to go back home.
Guys, look. Hey, what's going on with your shoes?
I would love to stay, but there's no place like home.
Here you go. We'll be all right. Right, guys?
Yeah.
Happy 16th birthday, my darling princess.
Mom, I missed you. I'm sorry for always being fiaking e makua.
It's okay. Here, my darling, I got this for you. Something you've always wanted.
Oh, Mom, you shouldn't have. Huh? Mom, these are all my clothes.
You're 16 now. You can go out there and have all the privacy you want. I packed all your stuff for you. And close the door on your way out. Love you.
Mom!
Wizard of Otara.